Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. Thanks for joining us for our regular strategy conversation with leading thinkers that's dedicated to the memory of one of the nation's most influential strategists, Andy Marshall. And joining us now is Michèle Flournoy, the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy during the Obama administration, co-founder of the Center for a New American Security think tank, as well as West Exec Advisors Consultancy, where she is a managing partner. And needless to say that with the election of a Democratic president, she would be in contention for any number of senior national security cabinet roles. Michèle, thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Good to be with you.
The coronavirus pandemic has already cost more than World War II, unemployed more Americans than since the Great Depression, killed as many people in 6 weeks as died, or at least Americans as died in Vietnam, sidelined major warships, delayed programs, exercises, you name it. China and Russia have been stepping up their game. Beijing is increasingly intimidating its neighbors as America has retreated from the world stage in a way that it hasn't in the past 75 years. What are the permanent changes in the wake of this crisis and lessons that we need to bear in mind as we prepare for the next major crisis?
Well, first of all, I think this pandemic, the way in which it has been mishandled, in the U.S. and the economic ramifications mean that we are in a very deep hole as a nation that will take some time to climb out of. I have total faith and confidence in the American people to recover and to recover stronger and more resilient than we were before. We've done that countless times in our history, and we will do it again. But it's going to be hard, and it's going to take some time. I think one of the casualties of this crisis has been, how the world sees the United States in terms of its global leadership. Historically, when we've had major global crises, whether it was the AIDS pandemic or the financial crisis or the Ebola outbreak, the US has always stepped up, in the context of the G20 or other multilateral institutions, to lead and orchestrate a more effective international response. That hasn't happened this time. And when you combine that with some of the missteps that the administration's made in handling the crisis here at home, I think that's really tarnished the U.S. credibility and U.S. standing. So it's going to take some time to recover from that. In addition, when we look at a more competitive global landscape, the competition with China, for example, is first and foremost economic and technological. It also has a military security dimension, but we have got to be able to reinvest in the drivers of our own competitiveness here at home. And that's going to be, a priority for any administration, should be a priority for any administration going forward.
The Trump administration has put competition at the center of its strategy, even though it may not have been executing it necessarily that way. China and Russia have been aggressively competing for advantage and recently scored some points by sending medical supplies and doctors to COVID-impacted countries, whether in Europe, Asia, and Africa. And there's a sense that Russia and China have both benefited from that, as both ratchet up disinformation campaigns, for example, and China tries to intimidate its neighbors. How do you characterize sort of the broader nature of the competition between the United States, China, and Russia as sort of a foundational principle to build a strategy off of?
I really think what we see is two very different authoritarian powers really trying to compete with the democratic world, if you will, to undermine faith and confidence in democracies and their ability to perform effectively, their ability to deal with crises like this. Now, I don't think anybody's fooled by Russia sending a plane load of equipment somewhere. I mean, Russia is a failing economy, failing model, if you will, that serves one person's interests, and that's Vladimir Putin, and certainly not the Russian people. And I think China, as much as it has tried to put forward this narrative of effective containment of the outbreak, it's well understood that they failed to share information, to report accurate information early on in the epidemic when it could have really made a difference to containing it globally. They suppressed doctors and healthcare professionals who were trying to alert the system as to how serious this was. They've used, they've executed what I call PPE diplomacy, protective
Mhm.
equipment diplomacy, sending plane loads around. But a number of countries have said, send it back, saying, hey, this is faulty equipment, it doesn't work. Or, you've attached too many strings and we're not going to be coerced through the use, through these supplies. I don't think they're going to come out smelling like a rose. But again, I think what I'm interested in is this question of what is really the nature of the competition and how do we compete well? And again, I would go back to first principles about investing in the drivers of our own competitiveness. And that's things like science and technology, research and development, access to higher education, particularly in the STEM fields, investing in 21st century infrastructure like 5G. Why in the world are we not unquestionably the global leader in 5G? We should be. Um, Smart immigration policy. We've always been able to attract the best and brightest from around the world and then convince them to stay. Look at Silicon Valley. Half of the founders are either immigrants or first generation Americans. So there's a lot that we can do to invest here at home, which will help accelerate our recovery out of this crisis, but will also make us much more competitive in the future. And then we can talk about what kind of investment we need to make in the military and other instruments of power to, to ensure that we can deter and if necessary prevail, vis-a-vis a country like China. But first and foremost, we really have to go back to basics on our own competitiveness and getting our own house in order.
And I want to talk about that because it's very, very heartening to hear somebody that is putting the STEM capability of the nation at the core. We became an economic leader because of the investments that we made after World War II, spurred by Sputnik, and generated those. Not only generated those scientists and engineers at home, but also became the haven for scientific talent around the world. Mick Mulvaney, just a short while ago, said that we've seen a 14% decline in the kind of foreign immigrant scientific talent that we'd like to see. Let me ask
And
you though.
if I could
Go
just
ahead.
say, Vaga, this is where we feel the lack of presidential leadership so acutely. You know, remember the speech that Kennedy gave when he said, we're going to space, we're going to the moon, and he inspired a nation to step up and compete and to do their best. It was a call to mission. It was a call to service. We don't have that today. And yet, I think with that kind of leadership backed by smart investment, we could step up again in that way if we treated this like a moonshot moment.
You and I have actually talked about that, and you've made this case before thoughtfully that there is actually power in setting sort of a lofty national goal. From a
Absolutely.
from a bread and butter perspective, though, one of the things President Eisenhower did after Sputnik, backed obviously by Congress because it was seen as a national emergency, was to create a program to generate a national program with tax breaks and investment and scholarships to create those engineers that actually allowed us to land on the moon, had their genesis in that program. And those scientists and engineers carried us in good stead until just about now, when most of them are kind of going off the stage. Do we need that kind of a national strategic education program?
I do think we need something like that. It may not look exactly like the Eisenhower program because I actually think today, Congress has done a reasonable job of putting together a number of authorities that basically offer loan forgiveness or scholarships for tech talent that's willing to serve in national security. coming out of their college or graduate degree programs. The problem is those authorities have just not been used very extensively, and many people in the government are not even aware that they exist, or they don't know how to use them. So I do think, I also think part of this is doing a much better job of incenting the private sector, and particularly cutting edge commercial companies, to be willing to work with the government, and to be willing to work with defense in particular. There are a lot of companies out there who actually want to contribute to the national security mission, but we still make it way too hard for them to actually do that, to be able to provide a clear path to recurring revenue, to be able to provide help in navigating all the intricacies of working for the federal government. We still make it much too hard.
It's one thing, if I can go to grand strategy for a moment, it's one thing to recognize you're in a competition. It's another thing to execute some form of strategy in a coordinated way that brings together economic, diplomatic, military, cultural elements of it that end up attracting you more friends. That's kind of been a model that the United States has sort of mastered for 3/4 of a century now. You've worked long-term strategy. In fact, in the first term of the Obama administration, you were working long-term competitive strategies actually at the Pentagon. What's the kind of long-term competitive strategy that we need that's informed by the mistakes of the last two administrations? Both on the Obama administration, there were successes and failures, and this administration that has had successes and failures.
Well, I think there are a few key elements. The first is to be clear about our objectives. If you take China as the pacing threat in a military sense, our objective is to prevent conflict with China as a nuclear weapon state. It is first and foremost deterrence. That could be deterrence by being able to deny them their objectives if they launch coercive or aggressive action. Can also be deterrence by cost imposition, to make any such action so costly that they decide not to pursue it. But first and foremost, it's about deterrence. And I think sometimes that gets lost in translation. China is clearly a competitor. They may choose to become an adversary, but we don't want to treat them in a way that they have no choice but to become an enemy. I think we have a lot of issues that we also need to work with China in a clear-eyed manner. This crisis, cooperating on how to address a global pandemic, was a missed opportunity. There are other issues like climate change, aspects of strategic stability. There are certain types of attacks that we should try to take off the table with China, and we can get into that if you want specifics. So the first thing is being much more clear-eyed about what exactly are we trying to do in the security realm with China. The second is the best approach to China or Russia is with and through our allies. It's one thing to have a bilateral, contest. It's quite another when the free market democracies of Asia and or Europe line up with the United States and push back together against aggressive or inappropriate actions by China or Russia. And we've lost that as a sort of central critical element of our strategy. The strategy documents talk about it. The national defense strategy has allies and partners as a key pillar, but in principle, beyond the sort of tactical and operational military piece, this administration has abused our allies more than they've strengthened the relationships with them, particularly at the White House level. And then the third piece is that you referred to is this takes all elements of our national power. The military alone cannot carry a national security strategy. And so we need to be showing up diplomatically, which we're not at this point. We need to be leading. We need to be finding common ground and enlisting our allies to join us, to share burdens, to approach tough problems together. And again, that's not happening. We also need to ensure that we're using our foreign assistance strategically. We're using our information and influence around the world strategically. But again, it's right now, the military seems to be the only tool that the administration consistently looks to, along with sanctions, I would say. So it looks to coercive measures like sanctions and use of military forces or positioning of military forces. It's not using the instruments of influence that have served us so well and have been so critical in the past.
I want to take it to something that you mentioned about things that we should do to drive the Chinese to take things off the table. What do you mean by that?
So one example is in Chinese military doctrine today. If you look at their preferred scenario, if they were going to move against Taiwan or some other strategic objective, they would hope to launch upfront severe attacks on both our space systems and use cyber attacks to try to thwart US power projection from the continental United States. So massive counterspace and cyber attacks to kind of cripple us, to stop us in our tracks, and to give them time to create a fait accompli before we can even get there to contest that. We need to have a strategic dialogue with China that says, wait a minute, do you really understand what you are talking about here? If you use cyber to take down the electrical grid around a military base where forces were deploying, you will, because we rely on civilian critical infrastructure, you will almost certainly be taking down the electricity of hospitals and other civilian facilities in the area. So by definition, such an attack will result in the deaths of Americans. You cannot believe that a US president would not feel compelled to respond in that instance. So don't think that you could launch surgical space and cyber attacks to prevent US power projection without accelerating the United States coming into a conflict. That's the kind of discussion we need to have with the Chinese to say, can we just agree that that's a really bad idea? And we were going to take those kinds of attack off the table early in a conflict. I'm not saying that they'd step up to that, but even if they didn't, having them really understand that it might not work out the way they hoped would be a very important deterrence message.
And effectively, it becomes a declaratory policy.
Yeah, it does. But I also think there are other areas where one of the problems, right, as a result of so much distance between what we say our strategy is and the unpredictability of this commander-in-chief in terms of what he actually does, is that our rivals, potential adversaries, powers we're trying to deter, they really don't understand where the lines are anymore. They don't know exactly what the US will defend and what we're committed to. And so we watched it with Iran, this steady escalation of provocations in the Gulf to try to figure out how far can we go, where is that line, and testing us. When we are not clear, we open ourselves up to that kind of testing and ultimately miscalculation. So I think the more we can use both words and deeds to clarify how we see our interests and what we will defend, the better the chance that deterrence will hold.
This is the first time that the United States is not leading in a major global crisis. And there are those who argue on both sides of the political aisle that the costs of recovering from this pandemic will be enormous, and the world has to do more for itself, that the United States has to focus more inwardly. That's a strain that's existed on the Democratic side as much as it has existed on the Republican side. What's the compelling case to make why it's absolutely critical the United States lead, even if it's expensive to do so?
When the United States doesn't lead, things come back to haunt us. This is a global pandemic. We are in the first wave. The fact that we have not stepped up to lead the international response, the fact that we've pretty much left the poorer developing countries, the most vulnerable around the world, pretty much on their own, means that, as this pandemic goes like wildfire through those countries, they will almost certainly be a source of a second wave that comes back to us. And we will be reminded once again of the global interconnected nature of the system that we live in. When we don't lead, it also creates a vacuum where others like China or Russia or whoever can step in and pursue their interests in ways that are often very much counter to our own. And then third, we just don't see, there's no one else who is willing to orchestrate things with a focus on the public good, the greater good, as opposed to just narrow self-interest. And so that kind of coordination internationally just doesn't happen if the US is not playing some kind of role. But we should be clear-eyed. I mean, so much of this is diplomacy, and diplomacy is not very expensive. It would not take a lot of money to rebuild the State Department and to have a much more activist US diplomatic presence around the world. It will be very hard to rebuild the State Department because of we've had so much brain drain at the ambassador level, at the level of people who've had 20 years in service and are ready to be those leaders. But this is, for a relatively small investment compared to, say, the defense budget, we could supercharge the effectiveness of our foreign policy, because we're most effective when the coercive elements like sanctions and the military are being harnessed in support of a clear diplomatic strategy, with the kind of diplomatic instruments and people and that we need to be effective. So American leadership doesn't have to mean military regime change of countries around the world. That, unfortunately, in the wake of the last 20 years, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth, when you say US global engagement, global leadership, and you get a weary response from Americans, they're thinking about long-term military occupations. They're not thinking in terms of political leadership and diplomacy. I think if President Trump is defeated and a Democratic administration steps in, I think there will be an opportunity to reassert smart US diplomatic leadership in a whole host of areas. And that will be something we can do affordably if we're smart about it. What I think the lasting damage is that, many of our allies don't necessarily see Trump as an individual anomaly. They see him as a sign that something fundamental has changed in America. And so even if you have one administration sort of resetting to a place that values allies and values diplomacy and values US global leadership, there's still going to be a little skepticism in the back of their heads until they see another administration come in and do the same thing. So this again, back to my point that this recovery, will take a long time, and we may never get back to exactly the same position we were in before. But I do think there will be a different kind of US global leadership that's possible, even in a more competitive multilateral or multipolar world.
Let me ask you about that competitive strategy, and you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the challenges is also consistent rhetoric costs you nothing and actually saves you a lot of money, because when bad actors see no gap between your rhetoric and your actions, they will take more seriously whatever you say. The concern with China in particular, even by talking to both allied friends but also Chinese friends, is this sense that the president really cares a lot about a trade deal, but not particularly much about the other elements. And the most dangerous thing is your potential adversary thinks that you don't care about allies and partners, right? And that leads to bad decision making that can be very, very problematic. At a time when we're going to be in under a lot of economic pressure, this stimulus funding, there will be many more tranches of this. There will be reductions in tax revenue. Not just the United States military, but militaries around the world are going to be hit. And they too are going to have to direct a portion of those military resources, perhaps to buying fewer combat aircraft or ships, than to invest, for example, in medical capability. There's already a push in the United States, hey, our hospitals, we should be focusing a little more resources on military hospitals and build new hospital ships and what have you. How do we need to navigate this future environment where we have fewer resources, we have a competition, we're going to have to do more on medical care, certainly. I mean, I think a lot of Americans are looking at the state of healthcare and saying we need to make an investment there. How do we need to be thinking about this period where we're still in a competitive world, but we'll have fewer resources? What's the mental framework we need to make the right calls here?
Yeah. I think the first thing is we have to think about national security in broader terms. And coming out of this pandemic, I think most Americans will expect that being able to have a public health and healthcare system that is capable of protecting them during a pandemic, should be thought of as an aspect of national security. So I think we will have a broader definition of sort of what counts and what needs to be considered a priority. I think when it comes to defense, there will certainly be downward pressures on the defense budget. And there will be, some very tough decisions that will have to be made. And I go back to the point about what are our primary objectives here, and I think viewing things through the lens of deterring coercive and aggressive action by authoritarian powers like China and Russia has got to be first and foremost. To me, I think some of the hard analysis that needs to be done is, where is finding the right balance between our investment in traditional platforms and our investment in the emerging capabilities, be it cyber, AI, hypersonics, all of the new technologies we like to talk about. Those technologies are what will make our legacy force survivable, relevant, effective in a very new and much more lethal and contested security environment. So, many of the service chiefs like to remind us that 60-70% of the force 10 years from now, 2030, will be legacy systems. And so what really matters is what you put on those systems in terms of new capabilities, how you use them differently with new operational concepts. That in an environment where it won't be a given that we have superiority in any domain of warfare. So it's a real challenge. That means to me that you have a lot of knee in the curve decisions, meaning, whatever number of aircraft carriers I want, or whatever number of fighter squadrons I ultimately think I want, or, tank brigades, or battalions, take whatever system you want to focus on, and you have to ask yourself at some point, where's the knee in the curve? Meaning, does it help my force more to buy the next platform, or does it help my force more to keep my current set of platforms and take that additional money and invest it in all of the capabilities that will buy back survivability, buy back range, buy back my ability to be combat effective in this very different environment? And those are the kinds of tough decisions that are going to have to be systematically taken in a much more constrained budget environment.
Do you think that there's the appetite for those we've been talking about making these kind of trade-offs for a long time, and whether it was President Obama or this administration or anybody else says, hey, we should buy fewer Chinooks or let's get rid of an aircraft carrier, there's an explosive debate about oh my, if everything's important, nothing's important. Are we at a position where you think that these kind of decisions will become easier to make because we have made these kind of trade-off decisions in the past?
I think that the military leadership in general understands that the foundation of our national security rests on our economic and technological competitiveness, and that I don't think you could find a 4-star in the Pentagon who thinks the military budget is going to continue to go up relatively unconstrained. They're all planning for reductions of some kind, or at least a flattening, if not some decline. I think it's harder on Capitol Hill. And I think, again, back to the leadership point, it's great to have service chiefs go up there and COCOMs go up to the Hill and testify that we're in, a crisis situation and we need to make tough choices and we really need you to back us up on this. And they need to do that. But you also have to have the full weight and power of the White House and the cabinet going up and saying, if you don't allow us to make some of these trade-offs and we continue to shape the defense budget by protecting, particular legacy programs, we are going to lose our edge and we are going to lose our ability to deter. The thing that's going to make it harder, much harder going forward, coming out of this crisis, is that all of those programs have some number of jobs attached to them. So the department also needs to be creative about identifying the fact that new jobs are being created of a different kind in pursuing these other emerging capabilities that we need. But I think that the level of dialogue and engagement with Congress has to be unprecedentedly high. You have to bring them inside the tent to help them understand what we're really facing as a national security matter and why the trade-offs are so important. But it's going to be hard in an environment where any cut means some loss, some potential loss, in terms of jobs, at least a reallocation of jobs across districts.
Let me take you to the question of allies and international organizations. We completely understand the importance of allies. I think most people do, whether you pay lip service to it or not. And I appreciate that there's going to be lasting impacts, particularly with U.S. actions in the wake of the pandemic. There were allies who didn't get any help from the United States. Not only did they not get help from the United States, but the United States actively competed against them for medical supplies, often outbidding them. All of our allies were sort of in the same boat. They too are going to be spending less money on national security, whether it's South Korea or even our European allies. And the institutions themselves are under pressure. So if you look at the EU, not only is it dealing with Brexit, but now 70% of Italians aren't crazy about the EU, in part because of concerns that the EU didn't do enough to help Italy in its time of need. And if your allies won't provide ventilators, it's a legitimate question to ask whether they'll provide troops in the event of a future crisis. How do we need to think about our allies and their capabilities? And then the impact that this crisis will have on accelerating concerns about big international organizations, even foundational ones like the EU and NATO?
Wow, that's a big question. I do think that many of our allies, particularly those in Europe, will be very inwardly focused as they try to engineer their own economic recoveries from this pandemic. And so, the other thing is, even if they hit 2% of spending, that'll mean a lot less given how the fundamentals of their economic situations have changed. So again, I think we need to focus collectively. We need to sit down and talk to each other first, and share views of how we see the threats, and then to really focus investment on deterrence of Russian conventional military action, but particularly deterrence of Russian gray zone action, which is what Europe has experienced most, and we have been experiencing in terms of intervention in elections, use of disinformation campaigns, and so forth. So I think we need to sit down with our allies and really come up with a very clear sense of what are we going to prioritize and where are we going to collectively accept and manage some degree of risk, given that we have very significant pressing needs to invest in other areas. So I think that's something we have to do. I personally believe that if we played our cards the right way, there's no question that we and the Europeans could step up and invest enough to have a very robust deterrence capability against Russia, and that is in the realm of affordability. So I just want to state that clearly. I also think the same is true in Asia. To have a much more closely and carefully coordinated, shared plan to invest in preventing conflict and deterring China. It's one, if you go to our partners and allies in Asia and say, pick sides, choose the US, choose China, they balk at that. They are very uncomfortable by that. It's the wrong approach because of, for any number of reasons. But if you go to them and say, look, we all have a strategic interest in preventing miscalculation and conflict in this region, and the way we're going to do that is to be very clear on what we're willing to collectively defend, and be very clear in our investment in the capabilities we need to back up that deterrence message. And together we are going to do this in an orchestrated, and coordinated manner. Again, I think that's an affordable investment for those countries and for us. But again, it takes US leadership, it takes some clarity on what you're trying to achieve, and it takes a willingness to roll up your sleeve and work day in and day out with your allies and partners to get to that shared objective.
Talking about China, do you think that there were a couple of potentially toxic strains that are sort of coming together over China? Obviously, it's a huge, economically powerful, technologically sophisticated country. It's becoming more assertive. It uses disinformation as a weapon, suppression of human rights, rounding up Hong Kong demonstrators, and saber rattling. But now there's a hold China accountable for this virus drive internationally. At the time that the economic aftermath of COVID is going to impact China very, very hard as well, at a time when China itself is becoming and rather fueling nationalism and xenophobia. Does China become potentially more dangerous as it becomes weaker?
I do think that China will face a lot of international pressure to deal with some of the root causes of these pandemics. Remember, this is not the first one. We had SARS as well. Whether it's wet markets that need to be shut down, or labs that, if you're going to do this work, you have to meet international safety and security standards, working on these naturally occurring viruses. But I do think there's some accountability measures that have to happen here, and they will feel that pressure. But I do think that the key thing to watch is, how insecure does President Xi feel? How insecure does the leadership feel? They got a huge domestic backlash for their own handling of this crisis. And that's what is fueling this effort to try to rewrite the story and change the narrative, and how China was the one that handled this so effectively, and China is the one that's running around the world providing countries in need with critical supplies. And all of that is first and foremost for domestic consumption, and to try to regain the standing of the administration with a very unhappy populace right now. They are taking an economic hit. They're going to take a second economic hit because they're such an export-focused economy, and global demand is not going to recover for quite some time. So this is a dicey period for the Chinese leadership. And I think when they are under pressure domestically, they do tend to try to create a different narrative externally. That could include, as we've already seen, some more aggressive action in places like the South China Sea, where they've recently sunk a Vietnamese fishing vessel, and also have stated some new territorial claims in disputed areas. So changing the subject with sort of aggressive action externally is definitely part of the Chinese leadership playbook, and we should be very attentive to that.
What do you think the role of defense and national security are going to be in the upcoming campaign, noting that you're going to be advising Vice President Biden, obviously, in his candidacy?
Well, I am very pleased and proud to advise Vice President Biden. I don't want to suggest that I'm speaking for him in any way, but so this is my own personal opinion. But I think the primary way it's going to play is the question of who is best qualified, who has the kind of temperament and gravitas and experience to be the best commander in chief. I think Trump's record on this issue speaks for itself. I think there are particularly independent voters, swing voters, who've become extremely uncomfortable with the way he's behaved in office. This, the sort of self-centeredness of the press conferences on the pandemic, the erratic actions in a range of international crises or situations, the politicization or the political use of the military, his interventions in matters of military justice. I mean, there's just a whole host of ways where the mantle of commander-in-chief has not sat comfortably on this president's shoulders. And I think he's demonstrated in many areas his unfitness for that aspect of the job. And so I think that commander-in-chief test is the first, is an important test for American voters to think about.
The 2 a.m. call.
Exactly. Are you really comfortable based on what we know from his performance over the last several years? And so I think that's the first way it comes into play. I think the other way is that, most Americans understand that, a president needs to be able to marshal and orchestrate all of the sources of our power to shape the world in a way that supports our prosperity and our security and our ability to defend the homeland and so forth. They understand that the military is not the only instrument that matters. They understand that sanctions aren't the answer to every dispute. I think they are very supportive of American diplomacy. They're very supportive of, incredibly supportive in polling of our unique network of allies and partnerships. So having a president who could actually leverage all of that to support not only our interests, but those that we share with other democracies and like-minded partners around the world, I think they're hungry for that. And I think they're just tired of the reality show of this White House. So I think national security and foreign policy should be a strong suit for the Democratic ticket in this election.
Is there a challenge to leading in this environment that is very different than past leaders have had to face? I know President Obama felt the sting of that in particular, but does that make it much, much harder to lead on any axis today?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. It's much harder to lead in this environment, even before the crisis. You know, the hyperpartisanship, prevalence of social media, and the outside influence in manipulating that. So, you know, I absolutely, this is not Eisenhower's America. It's not Kennedy's America. This is a very different challenge of leadership. That said, you know, a crisis like the one we're in right now, we would never wish it on anybody and not on ourselves. But there's always a leadership opportunity in a situation like this to pull the country together, to get us thinking about our common plight, our common interests, what we share. And again, it's a missed opportunity if a president doesn't seize that, if a Congress doesn't seize that. And frankly, we'll see how long it lasts, but I've been pleased to see that the Congress has been able to come together to legislate in this environment. They're doing their jobs in terms of stepping up. I hope that will continue because we're certainly not done yet. But no question, it's a more difficult environment. But again, I think leadership is still possible. And particularly in this crisis, Americans are begging for unity, they're begging for vision, they're begging for a promise of how are we going to recover and become more resilient as a society in the wake of this. And I think a presidential candidate that can, begin to deliver on that is going to come out of this election as the winner.
Michèle, thanks so much for spending so much time with us. We really appreciate
Thank
it. Look forward to
engaging
again. Hope you and yours stay safe, and I hope your son has nothing but a successful start to SEAL training. You must be very, very excited.
Very, very proud and very blessed. Thank you so much, and I hope you all stay healthy as well.
Thank you. And thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. Check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight, bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.